Okay, it is about time to get started this morning. And we are in Daniel chapter 6. Daniel chapter 6. If you would be turning in your Bibles there, that's where we'll be this morning for our Bible class. Before we begin our class, we'll have a word of prayer. Let's pray together. Our Father in heaven, we are so thankful once again this morning to come together to study the Scriptures. We're thankful, Father, for your servant Daniel and the example he provides to us of remaining steadfast and faithful even in the face of certain death. We pray, Father, that you will help us to emulate his faith, that you will help us to remember that you alone, out of all that exists, is able to deliver us from whatever oppression that we might face, is able to deliver us even from death. Father, we are so thankful that you have given us your Son, Jesus Christ, to give us the ultimate deliverance from sin and death, so that we might be with you forever. We pray, Father, that we will never compromise our faith, not in the face of fear, not in the face of persecution, not in the face even of imminent destruction, because we know that you have the crown of life available for us who are faithful until death. Pray these things in Christ's name. Amen. Okay. Daniel chapter 6. And really kind of flowing right on the heels of Daniel 5. And Daniel 5, Belshazzar was the king, or rather the co-regent, his father, and he was ruling in Babylon and throwing this big party. And then the writing on the wall appeared, and the basic meaning of it that they interpreted was that you're going to have your kingdom taken away from you, which happened that very night. The Persians showed up, and Belshazzar was slain, and in verse 31, Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. And now Darius the Mede is the king throughout chapter 6. But people read about Darius the Mede and they have all kinds of questions because, who was he? Who was Darius the Mede? So maybe talk about that briefly before we get into the text proper. We'll just start. What do we know about Darius the Mede? Okay. Who decreed that the Israelites would go back and rebuild Jerusalem? Cyrus. Okay. So, and Cyrus is the one who's usually given credit for conquering Babylon. So who's this other guy, Darius? What do we know about him? We're not really sure what his relationship with Cyrus is. We're not really sure what his relationship with Cyrus is, actually. He's 62 years old when he becomes king. We get that in verse 31, which sounds fairly oldish for a king. Most kings in the ancient world didn't live that long, usually because they tended to get killed. He is called king at least 28 times in Daniel 6, but remember, Belshazzar was called king, and he wasn't the sole ruler of Babylon at the time, so the term king can be a little bit flexible. Okay. Yeah, he does seem to like Daniel. That's true. Yeah, that's true. He was pretty malleable to his subordinates. The only historical witness that we have to Darius' existence is the book of Daniel. It's not mentioned anywhere else in the Bible or any other history. Outside of the Bible, the Persian kings we know of, which I detailed on the chart in the handout, Persian kings include Cyrus, Cambyses, Pseudo-Smyrtis, although some people don't count Pseudo-Smyrtis because he was basically an usurper. Darius the First, who is not to be confused with Darius the Mede. Darius the First was much later, and during his time, that's when the temple was rebuilt. That's when he made a decree that everybody, you Samaritans who are trying to stop Zerubbabel, you need to stop stopping Zerubbabel and start helping. He's going to make you pay for it out of your taxes, actually. And after Darius the First, there's also Okay, now that's very strange. I just realized that this handout in here is missing some kings. Well, after Darius the First, or also known as Darius the Great, you have a king named Xerxes, who is most famous to us for being married to Esther, book of Esther, and Artaxerxes, who was contemporary with Ezra and Nehemiah. Artaxerxes the First, correct? There's actually quite a lot of Artaxerxes because they liked that name. Nobody ever names their children that today for some reason. Mark. Yeah. What do we think of that? I mean, here's the lesson with that people have made that argument in the sense, although they don't include your snarky bit at the end about the rock in the desert. People have made the argument that, well, since we don't know about Darius anywhere else, he must have been completely made up. And critics are slow to learn because they were making the exact same argument about Belshazzar for hundreds of years before that got overturned. Before we knew that Belshazzar was co-regent with Nabonidus, there were a lot of different suggestions as to who he was. Some people suggested, following Josephus, that Belshazzar and Nabonidus were actually the same person. Which, a lot of believers would make that argument 100 years ago. Well, not 100 years ago, more like 200 years ago. But now nobody makes that argument because we know that Belshazzar and Nabonidus are two different people. Now with Darius, all we have are possibilities. We don't have the definite answer. Various suggestions that are made as, well, Darius is somebody that we know from history just under a different name. There's a guy named Gubaru, for instance, who was called the governor of Babylon, and since governor and king are sometimes indistinguishable in Aramaic, Akkadian parallel texts, the problem is that Gubaru became governor in the 4th year of Cyrus and not when the city was conquered, so it doesn't quite fit with the flow. Some people think that Darius was Cyrus's son, which, if that's true, then he's 62 years old. How old is Cyrus? It's up there in his years. We know he wasn't 62 years old. Some people think that Darius and Cyrus were the same person. And they argue Cyrus was his Persian name and Darius was his Median name. Right. Right. See, it's hard to read him. The two things I think are most likely are either is the same person as Cyrus, or he's some kind of co-regent with Cyrus, because the Medes and the Persians were allied together. So you got a Median king and a Persian king, and they're working together. And for some reason, history just forgot about the Median king. It doesn't appear that way. It appears that he stays in Babylon. And Darius appears to have been running things in Babylon. Babylon wasn't destroyed when it was captured. It was merely captured and reappropriated for Persian use. Because, that's a big city. You're going to destroy that. You're going to use it as your new fortress. But, there's all sorts of questions that come up and a lot of blanks that we just don't have filled in. Another thing that sometimes comes up is in chapter 6 and verse 28, where it says, at the end of the chapter, this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. There is a way to translate that where it says, this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius, that is Cyrus the Persian, which is a way to read that. And so they could theoretically still be the same person. And there's actually other texts, like in 1 Chronicles 5:26, for instance, uses the same expression to refer to Pul and Tiglath-Pileser, but it turned out, we found out they were the same guy. So the old King James doesn't renders them as if they were two different people, but then other versions have corrected that. So, that just may be what it is. And the date of Cyrus's birth is disputed, but 62 years would fit with what we know about him. So that's a possibility too. And another possibility is someone we just don't know from history. I mean, some kind of deputy king or some kind of, co-regent situation like you had with Belshazzar. And we ultimately don't know. But I think the instructive lesson that we need to take away from here is that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. For hundreds of years, Belshazzar was only known in the Bible, and history ultimately vindicated him anyway. And every critic who used absence of evidence as an argument for, undermining Daniel's historicity and undermining the existence of Belshazzar, they ultimately wound up being wrong. It's not a valid way of reasoning. And the same could be true of Darius. It's, we need to critics need to take care with that. I don't want to dwell on Darius too long, but I do want to at least point that out. This sometimes comes up, and ultimately there just isn't a leg to stand on. What we have here is we have the tale of Darius the Mede and his interaction with Daniel, and the lesson that we get from that is that ultimately, he's just another king of this earth. He might be a little more friendlier to Daniel than Nebuchadnezzar was, or Belshazzar was. But one of the emphases in this story is his inability to deliver Daniel as compared to the God of heaven. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and read, unless anybody has any more questions or comments on this subject. With that in mind, let's go ahead and read, and somebody go ahead and read the first 5 verses of Daniel chapter 6. Now, 120 satraps over the kingdom. That doesn't sound like he's just a regional governor, by the way. And just noting that in passing. Sounds like he's someone that's a little bit higher up the food chain. So the king appoints 120 satraps over the kingdom. And he submits these satraps to 3 commissioners. And one of those commissioners is Daniel. And Daniel, as usual, distinguishes himself because of his extraordinary spirit. The king is planning to set him over the whole kingdom. Perhaps Daniel gets to be major domo, second or third ruler in the kingdom, which, just like what he had with Belshazzar, for one day. And then for some reason that I just can't possibly imagine why, Daniel's rivals become jealous of him. And they don't want him to have this. Where have we seen this before? I'm sorry? Daniel in the lion's den. Yes. Right. Lots of places. There's one in particular in Daniel where this is a real emphatic theme. Daniel 6 is parallel, very strongly parallel to another chapter in the book of Daniel. And we're going to see a lot of points of correspondence between them. Chapter 3. What happened in Daniel chapter 3? Yeah, they're supposed to be bowing down Nebuchadnezzar's golden image. You guys don't do it. What happens? They get thrown in the fiery furnace. But, we have a similar thing. Before that happens even, we have a very similar thing to what happens here in Daniel 6, don't we? Where their fellow officials are out to get them. And the motivation appears to be the same in both cases. They're jealous of them. Now, exactly why they're jealous... how many Hebrews are going to be It's like here we are, Medians, Persians, Babylonians, whatever, and this Hebrew exile is about to be put in charge of all of us. It's you wonder how they're going to get him. Now the Hebrew is ambiguous as to how many. The Aramaic is ambiguous as to how many of the 120 administrators were actually involved in the plot. But how do we? How do his enemies kind of implicitly commend his behavior here? You see that? Kind of an implicit commendation. Why? Yeah. Bam. Right. They have no grounds to accuse Daniel. They can't get him on any government matter. He's not involved in any scandals or corruptions or anything like that. So we've got to tie it to his faith in his God. Which, says something too about the priorities in Daniel's life as well. He gave us all this. He's clearly good at his job. He gives priority to government matters. But these officials knew there was something more important in Daniel's life than that. And what they knew was that, his religion was more important to him than his government job, even if he's about to become number 2 or number 3 in the kingdom. His relationship with God had the high point, had the supremacy there. Anything else before we move on? That's just kind of making some notes here. Verses 6 through 9. Well, let's go ahead and read verses 6 through 9.
By agreement, both of King Christ forever. All the officials of the kingdom, effects, they try to tie up the governor, have consulted together the king to establish the statute. Anyone who makes a petition, any god or man, 30 days, ask life. Now, O king, establish long person. Both. Therefore, Christ, time.
Alright, so nobody is allowed to make any requests of anybody except the king. And just note that I made a mistake in a verse reference on the handout. And anyone who makes a request of any god or any man besides the king will be thrown to the lion. Does that law, by the way, does that necessarily imply that Darius thought he was a god? Not necessarily. Okay, yeah. And, the Persian kings didn't typically claim to be gods. It's more of a... What's the point of this decree that they're making in Daniel 6? Right, that's what their plan is. Why would the king have found... why are they throwing this idea to the king, I guess, I'd say? What's the appeal? Right. Right. So here we go. It's kind of designed to stroke his ego a little. The king's not so much claiming to be divine. It's just more of a, I must be really important because people have to filter their requests through me. I've become the intermediary.
If any Eric and established by purpose. Some of them, I'm sure, and some of them know are the second participation. And then they're God's character. And I read a lot of this combination of that there is a certain national
Okay. Well, there you go. I mean, the issue here, it boils down not so much to worshiping Darius. It boils down to whether or not somebody is a good citizen. If you don't show your loyalty to the king, if you don't show your loyalty to the empire by following this decree and filtering your requests through the king, well then, you're not being a good citizen. The Babylonians, the Persians, they didn't believe their kings to be gods in the sense that you start seeing with the imperial Rome. They see their kings more as representatives of the deity. And the people, they would honor the king. They would honor the king by withholding prayer from their gods and using the god's representative for their positions instead. Actually using the king as, this, basically affirming his role as the vicar of God on earth. Sort of like that, but it's you see that kind of thing all the time. It's an ego-stroking thing. There's another thing that's repeated 3 times in this chapter. This text emphasizes the fact that the laws of the Medes and the Persians cannot be changed. Why bring that up over and over and over?
They thought and start building for take. Let's back.
Does anybody know the other Bible story where they bring up the fact that the laws of the Medes and the Persians can't be changed? There's one other Bible story where they do that. Esther, right. And there's a typical government solution. We'll make a rule that we can't change the rules. Well, what if we decide that rule is a bad idea later? Can't change it. And it's kind of comical in a way, because every Bible story that's mentioned in, they wind up changing the law anyway by the end of the story because they can't even keep their own rules. So it's kind of a way of making fun of them. But here we see that this instance that the law of the Medes and the Persians cannot be changed, and yet by the end of the story, what happens is Darius makes a completely different decree and says, no, everybody has to worship the God of Daniel now. So right, but it's clear 30 days probably don't elapse before he goes into the den of the lions either. Because how long is it going to take to catch Daniel in the act? Yeah, they're going to get him on the first day. So we get to the part of the story where Daniel breaks the law. Verses 10 through 13. Somebody read that. Go. Just doesn't respect. A couple of interesting points to bring out here. Why does Daniel pray towards Jerusalem specifically? What's the point of that? It was his custom. Was there a reason for that custom? Yeah. There's that. There's that longing in the exiles, but there's also something very specific in Israel's history that this connects to. In 1 Kings chapter 8, whenever they first dedicate the temple, and Solomon is praying his prayer of benediction, he makes some remarks about how. All right, so I'll start reading in verse 46, 1 Kings 8. When they sin against you, for there is no man who does not sin. And you are angry with them and deliver them to an enemy, so that they take them away captive to the land of the enemy, far off or near. If they take thought in the land where they have been taken captive, and repent and make supplication to you in the land of those who have taken them captive, saying, we have sinned and have committed iniquity, and we have acted wickedly. If they return to you with all their heart and with all their soul in the land of their enemies who have taken them captive, and pray to you toward the land which you have given to their fathers, the city which you have chosen, and the house which I have built for your name, then hear their prayer and their supplication in heaven, your dwelling place. Maintain their cause. Forgive your people who have sinned against you and all their transgressions which they have transgressed against you. And make them objects of compassion before those whom have taken them captive, that they may have compassion on them. For they are your people and your inheritance, which you have brought forth from Egypt and from the midst of the iron furnace, that your eyes may be open to the supplication of your servant and to the supplication of your people Israel, to listen to them whenever they call to you. That was the prayer of Solomon, is that if they pray towards your house, your city in Jerusalem, hear from heaven and bring them back, essentially. And what's going on here, and we're going to see this very explicitly when we get to Daniel chapter 9, is Daniel is praying for a return from exile, which some of that seems to indicate that the decree of Cyrus hasn't really gone forth straight away yet. And Daniel 9 makes reference to it, that it's going to happen, or that it's happening. But that's still something that we're still kind of in the infancy stages of that, I guess. And so Daniel's praying towards Jerusalem for a return from exile, probably. Even after the temple's been destroyed, he still prays towards the house of God. And he makes this petition on a regular basis. But we'll have more to say about Daniel's specific petition when we get to Daniel chapter 9. The other thing we need to note is civil disobedience. This story has quite a bit to say, a little bit to say about that subject as well. Because here we go. The king has made a law that's the law of the land, and Daniel is breaking that law. What does this story teach us about civil disobedience? He's not making a public spectacle out of himself. Come back to that idea in a minute. Sometimes people read about stories in the Bible of civil disobedience. It's like, that I can get out of paying my taxes, or I can get out of doing this, or I can get out of doing that. I can just break all the laws. Is that the right way to read that story? No. Render unto Caesar's what is Caesar's. As far as it be with you, be at peace with all men, Paul said. Everyone is to be in subjection to the governing authorities. 1 Peter 2, fear God, honor the king. Those types of things. As far as it lies with us, as far as we are capable, to the best of our ability, we really ought to try to submit to the government's laws. But when there's a situation where the government's laws come into conflict with our devotion to God or our God's expectations for us, then we resort to the principle that the apostles had in Acts 4 and Acts 5. We should obey God rather than men. I thought that this quote was interesting. When prayer is fashionable, it is time to pray in secret. But when prayer is under pressure, to pray in secret is to give the appearance of fearing the king more than God. Daniel doesn't flaunt it, but he doesn't go hide in his closet either, which is kind of interesting. You'd think, do that, but he continues his exact procedure the same way.
They had been that altar. He wasn't out the street carrying signs, banners, saying, "I will pray to whoever I'm."
Right.
Or he wasn't hiding.
Well, he wasn't going around advertising, honk if you love Jesus. That's not...
Made a law, pray in public for America.
Pray before you eat.
Pray. Restaurant or not.
Yeah.
That's my custom. Not that I start that, but law, but I think about part.
Is there a time when we ought to pray in secret? And when is that? Yeah.
Show how
Look at me. Look how holy I am.
that
Yeah.
Jesus talked about the man all day long, but he's full like
Right. Okay. Well, he's broken the law. Now we get to verse 14, and somebody read down to verse 18. All right. Now there's a kind of a difference here. I compared this to chapter 3, where the friends are thrown in the fiery furnace. But there's a key difference here. What do you say is different from Darius to Nebuchadnezzar? He's troubled. What was Nebuchadnezzar's reaction to the whole thing whenever people disobeyed him? He got angry. He heated the furnace up 7 times hotter. He threw the 3 guys inside. But Darius actually tries to get Daniel out of this. So he tried all day. Now, what's the point? Why? What are we supposed to learn from the fact that he does not get Daniel out of the lion's den? His law is bigger than him. Well, something else is bigger than him too. Yeah, exactly. I think the whole point of this story is who can deliver. The king is not able to deliver, and so he makes this comment here. In verse 14, the king sought to deliver Daniel, but he doesn't succeed at it. So in verse 16, he says, "Your God will deliver you." Verse 20, he asks, "Has your God been able to deliver?" Verse 22, we learn that God does deliver. And the ending poem at the end of the chapter, Darius says about God that He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven, earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. And the whole point is that the kings of the earth, the most powerful guy in the world, can't deliver you, but God can. Because He has something that they don't. He has an authority that they don't have. The king's servant, we have a rule. No rules can be changed. You can't get out of this. You're stuck. So Daniel gets thrown into the lion's den. And interestingly, verse 16, it is the king and not Daniel who expresses the expectation that God will deliver. You don't really hear anything from Daniel. In fact, I think the only words that Daniel speaks in this whole story are when he responds to the king after the den is opened in verse 21, which is kind of interesting. I mean, obviously he said something since he's petitioning God, but his quoted words don't appear until much later in the story. The point, though, is salvation belongs to God alone. It's His prerogative. It doesn't belong to any human on this world. There's no human who can give it to you, and there's no human who can take it away from you. That power rests with the Lord. There's no ruler, there's no politician, there's no president who is righteous enough or well-intentioned enough to save you. Now, the main point of all of this, of course, another question I think that we might want to ask: who had it worse? Who had it worse, the king in the castle or Daniel in the den of the lions? Why? Yeah. Daniel gets sealed in the tomb and uses the seal to prevent the walls from being changed and Daniel's faith from being changed. And he spends all night fasting and refusing entertainment, not sleeping. The king's night in the castle is worse than Daniel's night. Lion's den. It's really quite miserable. But then we get to verse 19. They open the cave up and roll away the stone. And the king arose at dawn, at the break of day, and went in haste to the lion's den. And when he had come near the den to Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. The king spoke and said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? And Daniel spoke to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, inasmuch as I was found innocent before him, and also towards you, O king. I have committed no crime. And the king was very pleased and gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. The king then gave orders, and they brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they cast them, their children, and their wives into the lion's den. And they had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Wow. Okay. So the king runs to see Daniel's fate. He asks that question, has your God been able to deliver you? And, well, what happens? He gets an answer, which the fact that he gets an answer should say it all, right? God's angel shut the mouths of the lion. Once again, we have, just like in chapter 3, you have a fourth guy appearing in the furnace. Here you have an angel that appears and shuts the mouths of the lions. Daniel points out the fact that he's actually committed no crime, but God did the thing that the king could not do. He delivered. No injury was found on Daniel because he trusted God. Echoes the, it's just like in chapter 3. There was no fiery smell on the three friends because they had trusted God. Persians would have seen that, he gets out of the lion's den. The fact that he was not eaten, the Persians would have seen that as divine vindication. Daniel is off the hook for the crime committed because, the gods didn't want to punish him, they would say. And the men who tried to send Daniel to death by lions now get their just deserts by being sent to death by lions, also along with their families. And the lions, because they had not eaten all night, were hungry and ate them. So there's the one thing that is worth asking here. What if Daniel had been eaten by the lions? What if that had happened? What would that say about what would that say about the power of God? Would say something about his choice. That's the idea. Yes, Keith. Right. It's a good thing to bring up. In both Daniel 3 and Daniel 6, the attention at the end of the story isn't on the guy that got saved. It's on the reaction of the king to the fact that they got saved. In the case of Nebuchadnezzar and Darius, both of them respond by confessing the God of heaven, by making a decree that everybody should worship this God of heaven, claiming, what an amazing event has happened here. The story, the reason Daniel is delivered, if Daniel's not delivered by the lions, there's still a hope of if Daniel's not delivered from the lions, there's still a hope of resurrection that comes after that fact, which we'll talk about in a minute. Because ultimately God delivers everybody who's faithful to Him in the end, in the resurrection. Daniel himself affirms that in Daniel 12, that many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. There's going to be a final resurrection in which those who are righteous that were slain unjustly will actually be vindicated. But of course, we've got to get to that vindication first, and we've actually got to get to that point. The fact that Daniel is delivered from death this time is a message to everybody else. Daniel's not young either. He's fairly old by this point. This is, the other side of a 70-year exile. But God still delivers from death. He hasn't stopped listening to His people. God is... And if Daniel had not been delivered, it would not mean that God was powerless to save. It would mean that he simply chose not to. He chose not to make an example out of this particular instance. But because he has delivered Daniel, Daniel becomes a lesson for us all about what to do in the face of certain death, in the face of people saying, you choose your faith or your life. Now, there's another question that I think just kind of comes up, worth asking. How did the events of this chapter foreshadow Jesus? And there's more than one element to that. Okay. No fault in him. There was deliverance. Okay. Yeah, I see that. Okay. Right. Okay. See, you have similar elements in the stories. Like Matthew mentions the fact that Pilate put a seal on the stone of the lion's den. I think Matthew's making a conscious allusion to the Daniel story by pointing out that fact. You think about it. Why was Jesus even arrested in the first place? What were his foes motivated by? He claimed to be king. Yeah. One of the things it says in Matthew 27 and verse 18, Pilate knew that because of jealousy they had delivered him up. Daniel's foes were also motivated by jealousy. Daniel's, just like with Jesus and Daniel, both of them are in situations where they couldn't actually find a legitimate accusation, so they had to make one up. Both of them were arrested at a place of prayer. Both of them been accused before this ruler who tries to save them. That ruler wasn't able to save them because it wasn't the way God had arranged it. The ruler had sought to release him, but the leaders insist, oh, no, you can't do it. We have a law. We have a law. The Medes of the Persians cannot be changed. Or as in John 19, and we have a law. By that law he ought to die because he made himself out to be the Son of God. The leaders, even though he committed no crime, he was condemned to death. He was put into a tomb. Stone was rolled over the door. The seal was placed on it. And turns out he's delivered from death. Now Daniel was delivered from death in the sense that he didn't die. Jesus is delivered from death in the sense that God raised him from the dead. Those two ideas go hand in hand together. When Jesus prayed with loud crying and tears to the one who was able to deliver him from death and was heard because of his piety, the point isn't that he didn't die. The point is that death wasn't the end of him. Death isn't the final state. He gets resurrection as well. And one other thing. As a result of Daniel being delivered, his enemies get destroyed. Do we find a parallel with Jesus there? Where do we see that? Right. The message of the cross is as much a message of judgment and triumph as it is of atonement for sin as well. Colossians 2, for instance, talks about how when he had disarmed the rulers and authorities, he made a public display of them, having triumphed over them through him. Or 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 22, which says that he is at the right hand of God, having gone into heaven after angels and authorities and powers have been subjected to him. Here you have this idea of Christ triumphing over the enemies of this world, over the devil himself even, who had sought to destroy him. That didn't work out so good for him. And the point of the story is that God is always able to deliver from death. Sometimes he delivers us from death so that we die. Sometimes he delivers us from death in the sense that we come back to life in the final resurrection of the dead. And the same thing is true with us. Just as Jesus did nothing wrong and suffered for it, so we too, if we do nothing wrong and yet suffer for it, that finds favor with God. Those also who suffer according to the will of God shall entrust their souls to a faithful Creator in doing what is right. 1 Peter 4:19. So that's the basic idea here. And just to read the conclusion of the chapter, Darius the king wrote to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language who were living in all the land, "May your peace abound. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom, men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God and enduring forever. His kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. His dominion will be forever. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius, the reign of Cyrus the Persian. That's Daniel chapter 6, Daniel in the lion's den. Next time we will talk about Daniel chapter 7, and things are going to change a little bit in the type of story we're reading. I'll just say that. We'll read ahead. I suggest you read ahead and start reading some of these visions, kind of see where we're going, because some of it gets pretty intense after this point.